All right, so first thing with that out of the way, you may have come across this sculpture, and I think this offers a nice parable or tale for the world. But before we get into this is the it's called the Maman sculpture, and it was designed by French-American artist Louise Bourgeois, and there are actually several of these around the world. What I'd like you to do is just looking at this particular one is to just type in the chat what you think, what you perceive, what does it conjure up for you? And I think that might be an interesting exercise. And while people are doing that, Garry, what does it conjure up for you when you look at this sculpture?
It conjures up a large spider,
Yeah.
and it conjures up the fact that uh, eight legs on the ground is maybe better than two legs on the ground. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm a bit more of a realist on that. It is a spooky thing. I have seen one of these in London, and it was enormous. It was
Yeah.
in the National Gallery's South Bank, and it was a massive thing. So it's awe-inspiring. It's my thing.
Yeah, good stuff. We've got some good comments, interdependencies. We've got War of the Worlds, alien, unfriendly, unwholesome, threatening, spooky, danger, really interesting. And I actually didn't know lived in Ottawa, Ontario, in the capital of Canada, where in the National Gallery just outside is one of these sculptures. In fact, I think it's the original, and always walked by it, and I never really actually knew what it was all about. And so creativity, see one. So when you look at this sculpture and when you dive into what it's all about, maman means mama or mother in French. And actually this is an ode of the artist to her mother. And it's about how spiders take care of their young. The bit in the middle is actually their eggs. The artist, she had a very interesting relationship with her, not her mother, with her father, who wasn't a very nice person. So this is actually an ode to her mother. So I can see had problems with relationships, all this stuff. And so why put this? I could put any piece of art out here to start talking about that, but you can see there are multiple interpretations, and in fact that's what makes art art. There are many ways of seeing things, there are many ways of seeing the world, and in much respect, the parallel here for leadership, for decision making, is that there are multiple ways to view the world. Often there are multiple right answers to the problems that organizations face, or maybe there are no right answers, and sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we need to think about ourselves, our values, and that's a really big challenge to organizations and how they make decisions. We have a world where organizations are with very neat structures and categories and interpretations. It's a very much an engineering mindset that there is a right answer. We can unpick problems, and the world increasingly is not like that. And that's a challenge for decision makers. And that's where the practice of good decision making and exercising good judgment comes in, because we will never have all the facts. We will never be able to look at everything from every single perspective. And yet we still, as individuals and as organizations, need to make decisions. So what I want to dive into is some of the problems, and not the problems, the realities of how the world works. I mentioned I recently co-written a book called Decision Making in the Poly-Crisis Era. It's a big book. There's lots in it. But one of the things that when I describe the book, when I take people through what it's about, it's that a lot of the processes, structures, things that we do in organizations and in our lives to try and manage the world are really designed for almost like a flat earth, almost for not the Louise Bourgeois structure, but it's for trying to come up with the answer based on, say, a Lego set, right? So we're looking at the world in a different way from the reality. And what I mean by that is that we often think the world is discrete. So there in this book, there are chapters on AI and on cybersecurity and on geopolitics. And as you look at these things and you start to think about a particular topic, cybersecurity is one, you cannot disentangle that topic from, say, geopolitics. You cannot disentangle what's happening in the US elections, for example, from the debate over migration. So the world is interconnected. I wanted to stay away from the kind of now it's pretty much a trope, the VUCA trope, but the VUCA people are right. The world is interconnected, but the ways in which we try to manage those interconnectivities are not fit for purpose. The world's also asymmetrical. Things are asymmetrical, not symmetrical. I think the CrowdStrike thing that happened a couple of weeks ago now shows that where a small vulnerability can have cascading impacts. And so when we're thinking about trying to make decisions, it's not just about, well, we weigh up the factors over here against how much is we're putting against this threat or risk over here. It's much more nuanced. The world is asymmetrical. And the third one is this distinction between complex and complicated, which I think really unlocks a lot of where difficulties emanate, where they really come from. And the best distinction comes from Professor Dave Snowden, who has a thing called the Cattaneo framework, and he makes this distinction between the world that is complex and complicated. I've recently spoken to him for my podcast, by the way, and he runs through this beautifully. But basically, complex means that the world is kind of entangled. There are multiple ways in which we might be able to solve a problem or not, and complicated is an engineering problem. So there's a right answer. There's, my phone is complicated. There's lots of wires, there's lots of things in there. If there's a problem with it, you could probably isolate it and you could probably figure out what's going on. But the world is not like that. It's complex and static versus dynamic. And the things that we've built the world around, if you've ever come across the work of Ian McGilchrist, who talks about left and right brain, we've built a world predominantly for the left brain. For what is logical, and increasingly the world doesn't work like that, and we've over-indexed on the left brain stuff. We've under-indexed on what makes us human: creativity, curiosity, and good decision making is fundamentally about that. So I'll give Garry I'm sure you've got some thoughts based on that. So dumped a lot there.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just talk a little bit about prediction, because I don't know how many of you actually look at horoscopes. Most people decide astrology is a pseudoscience, and probably it is these days, but it's an interesting topic of why people want to know the future. It's a power thing. It's why I think even Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy, believed in getting a horoscope, or getting a forecast, seeing what the stars said. But we've always wanted to know the future. It's a human condition to want to know the future. And the more senior teams and boards and leadership teams want to feel confident about a future they don't know. So there are various things they do. This little word cloud is what I put for my book on navigating uncertainty. But actually, just take 4 pieces from it. Estimation, we do that. When we're planning for a future event or future outcome, we make an estimate. And both risk and strategy are casts into the future of what we think an outcome will be. So we do make estimates all the time. It is a reaction of humans to make estimates of a future. But prediction is where you're saying this is going to happen. And that's dangerous. It's risky. People make a lot of money out of political predictions and forecasting the outcome of elections and things, and markets. But the people who do that have one scenario in mind, and there are only 2 ways they can go. They can be lucky or they can be wrong. So prediction is a high risk thing to do in it. Firstly, a lot of organizations, businesses I work with are foresight and futures consultancies, where you accept that there's going to be more than one outcome. Is it possible? And most of them look at a matrix of things that could happen, futures that are desirable, futures that are undesirable, and scenarios that could happen and couldn't. So scenario planning. And the danger with that, it's a great thing to do, but you do have to get your axes right. Your X and Y, your vertical and horizontal axes have got to be the right metrics for getting the 4 or more alternative scenarios to be useful. Usually you're identifying a couple of ones you want to aim for and a couple you want to avoid. But confidence is the key word here. We make judgments based on what we know, plus an element of leaping into the unknown, an assumption or whatever. And it's that gap, that leap between the 70, 80, even 90% of what is certain about and the 30, 20, 10, whatever it is, percent that we don't know is where we make a judgment. And what is that judgment based on? Is it based on our experience, or is it based on hunch, or is it based on hope? Some of the words here you'll recognize. The danger with getting too confident, and senior people in leadership teams do suffer from this, is they can be too wrapped up in their own self-confidence, and this can be hubristic. So I take these 4 things really as looking as risks of dealing with the future. There's a lot more on this. I've written papers on astrology and Nostradamus and John Dee and all sorts of things if you really want to talk about it. But for today,
Garry, just some thoughts on what you just said there. A few things. One is I was speaking to someone who's a historian of tarot reading, tarot cards.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because what she was telling me was what it actually is a form of therapy. It's a way of talking about things that people don't normally get a chance to talk about, rather than trying to predict the future. But so just a little observation there. The other thing you mentioned is this thing around scenario planning. So and you mentioned axes, and so I just, maybe not everyone here is familiar with what scenario planning is. I've done a fair bit of work in this space. And there's a long history, but what you're really trying to do is not predict the future, but to identify a couple of extremes, right? So how could things evolve, not to predict, but to think about, well, what would happen if, how would we be able to withstand things? And I think it's a far more effective way of looking at uncertainty than traditional risk management. In fact, one of the things that you got the word risk in there, it's a word I'm breaking up with, because the world the world of risk is designed for the complicated, not the complex. It assumes that we can estimate impact, estimate likelihood, and the world really is more about this thing around uncertainty. And as you point out, it's not about managing uncertainty. I've come across that term. We should manage uncertainty. Bullshit. You can't manage uncertainty. You can navigate it. And so there's different ways of thinking and making decisions. That might seem a little bit still a little bit esoteric, but we'll get into some meat here. But I just wanted to pause to see if there were any questions or any comments or anything at all that anyone wanted to ask or react around, and we will get to it. If not, we'll continue to move on here. Don't see anything coming up in the chat. Garry, if you see anything,
okay,
let me know. But we'll come back to it. If anything that comes up, then just type it in and we'll get back to it. Okay, so another thing. So we talk about decision making. I'm really curious about this. What makes a good decision? What do people think a good decision looks like? And so again, if you have any views, please put those in the chat. It'd be interesting to just get a sense of the virtual room. Garry, what do you think makes a good decision?
What do I make a good decision? That's a good point. What makes a good decision is a decision that has an outcome that is what we anticipated, and therefore vindicates the decision-making process.
Already disagree with you there, but anyway.
Go on, I hand it back to you on that one.
No. Keep going. We'll see evaluation of options. Okay.
I think it's one that's been considered,
Hmm.
and it's considered a lot of viewpoints. I mean, the trouble with board decisions quite often
Hmm.
is they ignore key stakeholders,
Right.
uh, or they ignore external factors that they just haven't thought about.
Right.
I think there's a danger with a lot of bad decisions that they're made with too little information or too narrow a focus.
Hmm.
So I suppose a good decision is one that takes in widest possible set of circumstances and conditions. Yeah, you really are putting me on the spot there, Ben.
No, it's good. Both good and bad decisions are only determined with hindsight. Possibly a
Yeah.
risk-informed decision, possibly. It's interesting because if anyone who's in a leadership role, the question, do you think decision making is a fundamental leadership skill? They would probably tell you, yes, I absolutely. That's what I do. We make decisions. And then you ask leaders, have you ever received any leadership training? And most will have done so in one shape or form. And then you ask, have you ever been taught about good decision making? And hands go down. It's fascinating. Uh, it's a good decision making is a fundamental leadership skill, and yet we've never really been taught how to do it well. And it shows
Ben, can
up.
I just
Yeah.
bring up some of these things on the chat, which
Yes.
people have said I think is relevant? Just going through some of the comments here. A good decision is something you can back up with facts or intel, or a good decision is one where you've evaluated the options, or this is, I like, both good and bad decisions are only determined with hindsight. So this is Matt. Thank you very much for that.
Mhm.
Um, Another one we've had here is a risk-informed decision. So
Mhm.
that's somebody who's very into risk management, risk analysis. Another one is a good decision is one that fits the situation. I
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And there's another one you'd make again, given the information you have and your values
Yeah.
aspiration. I just thought I'd throw those up.
Yeah, those are all great. I think there's some really useful and truthful things in each of these. Um, but I'm gonna go back to pick on you, Gary, because you said something that, and I know you don't believe this, but you talked about outcomes and thought process around what makes a good decision as we look at the outcome. So this is something called outcome bias. We talked about bias, but there's a fallacy that we have, which is a good decision leads to a good outcome, and a bad decision leads to a bad outcome. And that's fundamentally untrue. That sometimes we can make the best decision we can, but we don't get the outcome that we want. Or we could do the opposite. We see this a lot in sport. And then what we then do is if, we made a great decision, but it didn't work out, what we do is we beat ourselves up or we blame someone, or even worse in organizations. And you see this in organizations, you see this in sport all the time. Someone just happened to luck into a good decision by being at the right place at the right time, and they get promoted and is hailed as some sort of a genius. And we are not very good at distinguishing between the outcome and how decisions get made. And that's the key fundamental distinction. The only way to really judge whether or not we've made a good decision is to think about how we've made that decision. One of my favorite people in the entire world in this space is Annie Duke. I had her on the podcast 3 times. She is a poker champion, world poker champion. And she has a wonderful analogy, which is, it's like playing a hand in poker, that you play the best hand you can based on the cards that you're dealt. And sometimes that won't work out because of good luck or bad luck. Over time, that's where the skill and the practice of decision quality comes through, because over time you get more of what you want. And that's decision quality in a nutshell. So I know you know this, Gary. So I'm not, but it was just thought I'd use the your mention of outcome there because it's what happens. And actually, if you look around, if you look in the press, you see outcome bias all over the place. And if you look inside your organization, you will see it. And it's something that you need to combat. You need to work against, because that's where the value is. So with that in mind, I'm just going to dive into this next bit. I don't want to drain this too much, but I get asked what goes into a good decision. And so when I answer that question, I use this the Decision-Making Studios focus framework. What this simply is a way of grouping a lot of good research that comes from lots of places around decision-making into a very memorable word called focus. There's lots of stuff in the decision quality literature. Sometimes you come up with 8 things or 4 things, but we think that focus is a useful word to think about. And it seems to me these days that the best way to go viral on LinkedIn is to write a post that says how to save your job from AI. And I think that and it's inevitably it gets into, you need to learn about AI and do this and do that. To me, how to, not just save your job, but to do some fantastic, meaningful work is to lean into the skills behind this. It's to lean into critical thinking and creativity and a variety of things, because what goes into each of these things is not just analysis, but it's integrating what makes us human. I'm going to run through this very, very quickly because I have a whole course, and a lot of the work that I do hangs off of this. But just so that you know what we're talking about here, framing, which is the F, what it is deciding how to decide. So does this align with our values? Is this a big or small decision? We make 35,000 decisions a day. Most of the time, we need to make decisions quickly. Very few times where actually we need to stop and say, hey, we need to dive into this more. We need to be able to discern that. That's a framing skill that's really important. The O is for options, and what we're trying to achieve here is not too many, not too few. In organizations, if you look at how most investment committees work, they have something called either or fallacy. It's another bias, which is you look at a business case, whether or not to invest something, and it's yes, no, yay, go, no, go. And it is sapping so much value out of organizations because other options aren't being considered. And conversely, the other side of the options bit is this sort of Netflix problem, the paradox of choice, too many things and not able to decide. So being really good at identifying options, and there's some creativity involved here, right? So you need to think about other ways in which we can achieve the same outcome, also an important skill. We're going to focus on the C and the U here a little bit more, cognitive diversity. And cognitive diversity obviously is about getting different viewpoints. And the emphasis isn't on demographic diversity. Sometimes we think because some board might be demographically diverse, that somehow we've got different viewpoints. Or we might think that because there's diversity in a team, that somehow we're going to get, again, diverse viewpoints. But if we're not practicing inclusion alongside that cognitive diversity, or if we are hiring people who've all gone to Oxford and Cambridge, that's also not cognitive diversity. So there's a lot here. There's a lot here about human emotion that needs to be brought in. And good decision making doesn't think away or process away emotions and human factors. It integrates them. And that's a fundamental skill that that more executives should be building. The U is for uncertainty, not risk, but thinking about the world probabilistically. I talk about uncertainty, in fact, as an emotional problem. We can think about things that we can come up with a probability of something working out, but what if it doesn't work out? And there's so many traps around getting to a good place of uncertainty. And the S is selection. So we choose an option, and then once we choose, we don't reopen it. So there's a lot here. This is also potentially a very useful communications tool when you want to implement something. What is often missed a lot, and one of the little litmus tests I use is how is a decision communicated? And if a question comes up, and I came up with a little guide which I can send across, which are these snarky questions around. For example, think about a decision and think about the question, what the fuck were they thinking? Often you get those questions because some of these things haven't actually been thought through, or who's the genius that came up with this, and that might come up with a thought process around, well, actually we didn't include a wide variety of views and viewpoints. We didn't do that very well. So that's just to give a little bit of an overview of decision quality. Again, this is grouping of lots of stuff that is out there in the scientific literature and good practices into 5 things. You'll see different things expressed in slightly different ways, but we think this is a useful, very memorable way to think about it. I'm going to pause here to see if there are any other We've got Phil said decision quality versus luck. Yeah, agree with that. Um, unlocks a better path. Garry, any thoughts on what
No,
I
I just
shared?
think the focus framework is very good, and I think a lot of people could benefit from using it. But as we said before, I slipped into the wrong answer, and you're quite
Yeah, yeah.
right. Is a lot of people judge a good decision by the outcome, and
Yeah.
although that's technically wrong, it is what most people on this blog chat and me and the world and the business world would
Well,
say.
you've
So
you
we're
but
saying
you
we're saying they've got
yeah.
it wrong.
No, that's great. But you've just demonstrated in action what a bias is.
Yeah.
And when we think about this, we think, oh, well, we've got bias, cognitive bias. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad, but it's a thing,
Mm.
and it's a thing because we're human. And the fact that you said that, and I know that you're very very smart man and very well read, but we all slip into that, not because we're dumb or silly or whatever, is because we're human, and that's what we need to account for, and that's what is often forgotten. That we actually have to account for the humanity and the way in which our brains work, the way in which we trick ourselves, because of all of this stuff. And when we say, and this is where I think people sort of shy away, or we'll get into the bias discussion, but I think we often shy away from really leaning into decision making and assumptions and judgments and biases, partly because we're afraid of what people might think, or that we're calling someone out to say, well, you've
I think one of the things I find with boards is that quite often they feel they've got to make a decision because they've convened a meeting today,
hmm,
and they feel they've got to make a decision today because they're all there. And it takes a very brave chair or a very brave person who leads the discussion to say, what is the downside? Why can't we make this decision next time we meet?
hmm,
Why don't we go and get some more information? And I think sometimes decisions are made with a time frame or a time limit, which actually means they're not as good as they could be because there's the conditions under which they are being made are self-inflicted pressure.
yeah,
Anyway,
absolutely.
that's
Absolutely. Okay, so look, in the interest of there's good stuff to cover, and we want to dive into now this the enemies of a couple of the enemies of really good judgment. And this is I love this slide. This is from Garry. We've got ignorance and we've got bias, and ignorance what we don't know, bias what we think we know. And so, Garry, if you just talk us through this, I think it'll be
yeah,
fascinating.
I mean, the last few months, or last year or two, there have been quite a few new books on ignorance out there. In fact, for those in the UK who listen to Radio 4, there's a series by Rory Stewart that's been on for the last few weeks just on ignorance, and just how important it is in our whole lives. The fact that we reward clever people, we incentivize people, we educate children to be clever, and the whole thing of ignorance is a bad thing, but it's what we all live with, and the more um, correct, the more humble thing to do is say actually the things we don't know. But boards and senior leadership teams don't like to say they don't know something. They fear that investors will think worse of them, or regulators, or customers. Certainly, shareholders will think, "Gosh, what they don't know." So boards often manufacture certainty, and therein lies an enormous decision risk. And I think ignorance is something I've done a lot of work on, and I'm going to show you a chart in a minute showing the difference between intractable uncertainty, which are those things we can't know because they're so far in the future or they're beyond our comprehension, and the things where we could know, but we haven't got the information but we could find it. So the difference between intractable uncertainty and imperfect information. And in Kay and King's book on radical uncertainty, those are explained as the difference between mysteries and puzzles. A mystery is something you can't solve, but a puzzle is something you can. So it's quite important when you're dealing with ignorance to know what type of ignorance and the cause of it. And the same with bias. Things we think we know, and the older we get, the more we rely on this, is as we've got individual experience and opinion, which form our perceptions and our beliefs. And as we get into groups to make decisions, either as project teams or departments or whole company boards, we've got the issue of politics, internal politics, and the prejudice of who we trust, who's thrusting and who's holding us back, and preferences and wisdom, the whole thing there. So can I do the next few slides,
Yeah,
Ben?
absolutely.
If you whack a mark, there we go. So the first one on ignorance, I think this is quite an interesting way of looking at it. If you look at the horizontal axis, on the left-hand side, you've got the intractable uncertainty, which is what can't be known. And on the right-hand side, you've got the imperfect information, which are those things that could be known if we just went and found them or made some effort to get up and find them. So that's your horizontal axis. The vertical axis is the difference between accidental ignorance, those things that we just don't know, and deliberate ignorance, which is very, very interesting. These are things we deliberately don't want to know, either because we don't want to find out the answers. And there are all sorts of examples, like people refusing to go and have a test for cancer in case they find out something they don't like, or refusing to get involved with something because they just don't like the sound of the consequences. So the deliberate and accidental, there's a book came out 2 years ago called Deliberate Ignorance, which explains all that. So I won't go into that too much. But if I talk to you about the quadrants on this, if you take the top left quadrant, where you've got the accidental and the intractable, and this is what we call the unknown unknowns, what Donald Rumsfeld rather clumsily called the things we don't know we don't know. So don't waste time on that. You're not going to spend time on that. If you go to the top right, which is accidental ignorance and imperfect information, what you're doing there, why you've got ignorance there, is because you're not asking the right questions. Now, whether you're a project team or a corporate board, you've got to think there, are we asking the right questions? And a lot of what Ben's talking about on decision making is about actually asking the right questions. So I think that's quite an important area to focus on. If we drop down to the bottom right-hand quadrant, where you've got deliberate ignorance and imperfect information, this is head in the sand territory. This is where we just don't want to know. And then you've got to think, why? Why do we not want to know? Oh God, my screen's going to go off in a minute. The bottom left here is the intractable uncertainty and deliberate ignorance. And here we are, can't see this, Ben, what does that say?
It says no point in trying to find out.
No point in trying to find out. That's the crazy thing, is that because it's deliberate ignorance and because it is intractable uncertainty, you'll be wasting your time in doing that. So the things to focus on are the two on the right. They're not asking the right questions, and we just don't want to know. Okay, if we move on one, please.
Just very quickly, we just don't want to know part grabbed me. Because in some of my previous work, interactions with senior leaders and also boards, particularly with boards, there's something in the we just don't want to know if you bring something, and because of all the sort of legal fiduciary responsibilities to board directors and all that stuff, they have to do something about it. So I think that this is a real problem in boards, that there's almost an active pushing of things into the we don't want to know bucket that leads to lots of problems. And I'm just wondering what your views are, because I think it's a problem with boards and executive teams that is far more intractable than people realize.
I agree. I mean, the whole purpose of this matrix really is to ensure that when you're dealing with a group decision, okay, I'm assuming this is a team or a board or somebody, you've got to identify the cause and the source of the ignorance. And that we just don't want to know. You've got to drill down and find out why. What is it you're afraid of? I mean, one of the talks I've been doing for years at Henley is all about unseen and unspoken risk. In other words, the things that we just don't know or don't want to know. And I think that's very important, is to find out why. And that leads back to your emotional point. Why are we not looking for these things? Why are we ignorant in that area? What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of the cost of it? Are we afraid that we find something we can't handle? I think that's very, very important. And too often it's quite easy actually to go to the box above it and just reframe the question. Because I think sometimes you get stuck. We don't want to know because we're not asking the right question. So actually just ask the right question and you can get there. But there's more to do on that right-hand side.
Right. Well, I think that's a skill for executive team members, particularly with non-executive directors, that they need to start to know how to ask the right questions, how to spot these biases and judgments, and then that leads to better conversations and ultimately better decisions. I was having a discussion with someone the other day. Actually, not just not the other day, but a little while ago, but it was about investments in things like cyber security, and this person was really adamant that we need better business cases. We need to quantify the problem more effectively. And I said, actually, in this case, and this was, I think it was a chief information security officer or something. What's happening is the board is telling that person to fuck off because the issue is that the CEO is probably there for a short tenure. I think CFOs now in the UK are in post for a little bit of a longer tenure, but the sort of the payoff for doing some of this stuff, the incentives are totally misaligned. And so
Yeah.
a better business case is not going to unlock the problem. What actually will unlock the problem is a bit of psychology and a little bit of thinking through some emotional arguments, some tapping into on your watch. Is this really what you want to have happen? And that, I think, the sort of reframing can really unlock discussions that are often on repeat. Again, it's something that is that you're right. Asking the right questions can do that. I'll move on to
Okay.
the
Should we
sure,
go on to the next one?
absolutely.
The other, I mean, bias, there's a whole set of lectures on bias. I've even seen a chart that shows somebody said that there are 118 different biases. I mean, academics get so wrapped up in how many different biases business users, and people say, well, I just want to know the ones that can affect me and our decision making. So I tend, when I work with a team, to look at no more than 12, and I put them into 4 boxes. And this is entirely what works with the people I've worked with. It might work for you, might not. If we look at two criteria, one is biases that you bring to the table as an individual, and biases that you as a group of individuals suffer from. And then that's sort of one axis. And the other axis is biases that are essentially tactical, as opposed to those which are strategic. And those will become obvious. So I'll just go through this. Top left box. These are biases that you bring to the table as an individual because they're to do with your personal perception, such as familiarity, such as brain speed, such as loss aversion. I'm not going to go into the great details. You probably can imagine them. There are a lot of other things that you bring to the table as an individual. Moving across the top right, this is where a lot of biases happen, behavioral biases in group decisions. That's the psychology of groups, where you have obedience to the person on the top. You have reducing dissonance because you want to be seen as collegiate and helpful and a team player, and it's affinity bias and all sorts of things, and can lead to groupthink. And these are really where the biases happen because of the personalities in the room and construction of the unit or the group or the team that is making the decisions. Those are the two most common. Two others down the bottom I think are worth looking at. Bottom left, structural. This is important where you have people who don't attend every meeting, such as non-exec directors in a board meeting. They have less knowledge, and they are under pressure to fill in the gaps and learn, and they will be looking for patterns and what you did last time, and they won't necessarily, and this will be a bias because they're going with what they've got available, and there's a time to make a decision with what they've got. So a lot of bias creeps into board meetings and other meetings where you've got people who are not there frequently. Whatever your organization is, however you have meetings, it's the infrequency causes a problem because it builds in bits of ignorance. And the bottom right one, which is the operational, is where you are in a team on a project, and of course, largely reporting on how the project's going. You're going to look for confirmation that it's on track, it's on budget, it's doing this, it's doing that, and you will be selective in the KPIs you present. You will say that we're doing very well and blah, 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 and what we've spent so far is definitely worthwhile, and we mustn't can the project. You know, it might be a rail project or a hospital project, but we can't stop it now. We've spent too much. We've sunk cost. So these are just sort of groups of bias I tend to look at. Again, as with the ignorance, it's important not necessarily to identify each one or have it get the right name. It doesn't matter what the name is. It's the cause and the source of it. Why have you got it? What's caused it? And can you do anything to debias or neutralize it. Now, in talking to Ben about this yesterday, we mustn't assume that everybody wants to debias. I mean, McKinsey wrote a paper a few years ago on neutralizing bias. If you're a non-exec director just joining a board and you spot bias, it's no good saying, I spot bias, this is a bad thing. You just get shouted down.
Yeah.
Sometimes a powerful chair or boss or leader will actually encourage bias because it gets people to be obedient to their authority, and it gets what they want out of the meeting. So sometimes you have to live with it. So it's not just so seeing it, it's how you work with it.
Yeah. So I was just a couple of reactions to that is that a lot of this stuff comes from this is work, academic work that's 40, 50 years old. That seems to have been recently discovered. But you're right that again, the where bias comes from is the way our brains are wired. So there's an evolutionary advantage to thinking quickly and shortcutting. This is the famous thinking fast and slow. But beyond that, there's a whole realm of work. It's called naturalistic decision making. A fellow by the name of Garry. If you ever heard of the term the pre-mortem, he invented it, and he worked with Daniel Kahneman, who came up with some of the bias stuff. But anyway, there are ways that sometimes we want to lean into bias, right? If there's a recurring decision. In fact, this is how marketing works. Marketing leans into our biases. But if we want to get people to behave a certain way, we can design rules, requirements, particularly recurring decisions in a way that leverages those biases. And so as you mentioned that, Garry, it's not just that biases are bad. Biases are there. And so the solution isn't always to eradicate them, but is to understand what's going on and to try to lean into what is going on. Sorry, I will. I'm just in the interest of time. There's just one other thing to just to touch on. One of the most important things in debiasing and trying to have better conversations is concept of psychological safety. And what does that really mean? It doesn't mean everyone being nice to each other, right? Psychological safety is the safety to say to perhaps the most senior person in the organization, I think you're wrong, and to not be punished for that. That's what psychological safety is. I think a lot of organizations think about it as a sort of a kumbaya, let everyone love each other kind of a thing, which is fake, and it doesn't really work. But there are ways in which we can mitigate bias. These are three things I talk about in the course that I do. There's the pre-mortem that I mentioned. There's a thing called think, write, share, where you get people to write their thoughts, and even anonymously, and you talk about those ideas when we're making a decision in a way that it's almost impossible to attribute where that idea comes from. So you're talking about the best ideas, regardless of who came up with those ideas. And I'll stop there. Actually, one other thing to mention, you mentioned big projects and programs, things that executive teams and boards get involved in. And I've in my past worked with a lot of project, program management teams, and most projects and programs and most organizations are well behind budget and schedule, and it's a thing. And if you talk to people involved in that, we have to get better at delivery. We have to get better at a thing called program risk management, which I think is something called, which should be called trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Because what's happening is, when we talk about bias in big programs, there's optimism bias that's baked into the targets and the timelines of most big programs. And in order to really get at better performance of these things, you have to go right to the source, which is where those decisions get made. And that there are a few great techniques around doing that. But I'm going to pause there just in the interest of time. I'm just going to check in on the chat before we wrap up. I can't see anything that's come through at the moment. Program risk, yeah, baked in. Absolutely. Program risk is baked into the decision point. In fact, you talk to program teams who actually have delivered a program on budget, and they act like they've achieved a superhuman feat, because often they have, because they've worked against all the odds to try to deliver something where the odds were really stacked against them delivering. And so we need to get away from this concept of just getting better at program delivery. Program decision making is where we need to get better in most organizations. Garry, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm conscious of time too. I think it'd be very interesting to have feedback after it from some of these people. whether they found this useful in their own particular challenges in their organizations and the units and decision-making groups they're in. Whether this is a bridge too far, whether this is unachievable, whether this is realistic, or whether there's something here that they could really take and work with. So I'd like some feedback, because this is, we're not academics. We are trying to get something useful here to people.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'm just going to wrap up and just to say a few things. The Decision Making Studios is my firm. We're hyper focused on decision quality. Our two points of focus are our clients and decision quality. And there are lots of ways in which we do that. In fact, if you would like Garry and I to come and talk to your team about some of these things in a little bit more depth, we'd be very happy to do that. We do workshops. I do a thing called one-off decision navigation, where the idea is sit alongside a decision-making team and try to challenge and try to make sure that that decision is being made in the most high-quality way. And I have a thing called the Decision Compass, which is trying to figure out where key decision points in processes and procedures and rules and all kinds of things, where they exist, and how to design in decision quality into those processes, procedures. My email is below. You can get in touch with, in fact, you get with both of us. And if none of that is of interest, there are a couple of things you might want to think about. I have a course called Decision Navigators. I think a couple of people here have been on that course. It's a 3-hour sort of taster session on decision quality, running a couple of cohorts on the 24th and the 21st of September. And absolutely free is the Decision Making Studio podcast. Lots of, I've never been more excited by the quality of guests that we've got coming on. Most recently had Alex Edmonds, who's a very famous person in the world of finance and sustainability, and fabulous conversation. You can check those out. Absolutely free. I'll stop there and just thank you all for your time. Really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to listen to us. Do send across any feedback, any thoughts, any questions. Happy to continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks all.
Good stuff.